Hello everyone and welcome to part 3 of the appendicular skeleton, where we will be talking about the arm. Now in part 2, remember we spoke about the pelvic girdle, but in part 1 of the appendicular skeleton, we actually spoke about the pectoral or the shoulder girdle. Now remember, we said that we were going to attach our arm to the axial skeleton by our pectoral girdle. And I apologize, but we have a helper today. Okay, now the shoulder girdle, remember that consisted of our scapula and our clavicle. On our scapula, we saw that we had a glenoid cavity. And our upper arm bone, the humerus, is going to articulate with that glenoid cavity right here. So when we're looking at the humerus, the first thing we need to be able to do, oh, sweet girl, is figure out which part is the anterior side or the front side and which side is the back side or the posterior side. And that's going to be really important if I were to ask you if this is the right or the left humerus. So let's talk about it. Now, if I were you, the first thing I would look for is where is that little fossa? Now remember, fossa means dip, okay? Now here we can see we have a dip or a fossa, and right here we see a fossa. The fossa on this side is much more shallow or smaller than the fossa on that side. The anterior side will have the smaller fossa or the more shallow fossa. I'll tell you the name for that in a moment. But to know which side's anterior, you just put the little dip in the front. The next thing you want to look for is you want to make sure that this part, the smooth kind of rounded portion, which is the head of the humerus, you need to make sure that this is facing towards the body, because that's the part that's going to articulate with that glenoid cavity. We'll talk more about the joints in our next unit. Now that we know that we put this part in the front and we put this part toward the body, then we know that this must be the left humerus. This will go on the left side of, remember, the patient's, not your body. Now let's go ahead and look at the key features of our humerus. We said that we have this head right here. Right behind the head, we have this shallow groove, and this is going to mark, just like we have a head that's followed by a neck, this has a head that's followed by a neck. But this is called the anatomical neck. We actually have another neck, and it's right here, and that's called our surgical neck. And this is the part, when I try to remember surgical neck, I just think if I were going to do surgery on someone's arm and I had to amputate it, where would I naturally cut it? Now that's not the most accurate view, but it helps. It's a tool to remember, okay? Now, the interesting thing about the surgical neck is that this is the part of the arm, or rather the proximal arm, that will be most likely to be fractured, especially in older individuals. But it is a bit of a misnomer because surgery is not the way that you will traditionally fix a break to the surgical neck. In fact, typically just isolating it and putting it in a sling is enough to heal a fracture to the surgical neck. Moving on. We see that we have two little notches here, and we're going to call those tubercles. We have a greater tubercle. The greater tubercle is higher up and it's bigger. And then we have a lesser tubercle, which is a bit lower and also a bit smaller. Between those tubercles, we have a groove here. And that's going to be called our intertubular groove. If we go down a bit, we see that, well, this part will be called the shaft. And we'll see that we have a sort of rough patch on the humerus where our deltoid will attach, and that will be called the deltoid tuberosity. A tuberosity is something we'll see often, rather the word tuberosity, and that generally just means it's a rough patch of bone where a muscle will attach. If we follow this down, we said we have the shallow fossa and we have this bigger fossa. If we look at this shallow fossa, that has a name that's called the coronoid fossa. The coronoid fossa. Looking at the back here, this is our olecranon fossa. I believe you just meant my other cat packs. All right, my olecranon fossa. Okay, so coronoid fossa, olecranon fossa. It's the coronoid fossa that goes in the front. We also have a couple epicondyles. We have a medial epicondyle, and we have a lateral epicondyle. Notice that the lateral epicondyle is not this, that's something else, okay? This is the lateral epicondyle. Now, often people want to look at this and say, oh, okay, well, the medial epicondyle is bigger and that's how I'm going to remember it. I don't like that approach, and I'll show you why. If we turn this around, now which one looks bigger? The lateral epicondyle looks bigger, okay? So the better way to look at this is to remember that the medial epicondyle is just below the head. And remember, the head is going to be facing toward medial, right? It's going to be facing toward the body, okay? So the head is medial, and so this is the medial epicondyle. If the head is facing away and we're looking at the back of it, then that's the lateral epicondyle, okay? You can also see the lateral epicondyle, like I said, right here, but it's going to look smaller from the anterior view. This structure here, it looks kind of bulbous here. That's your capitulum. And this structure looks a bit like a spindle. And look, it takes up this whole piece right here. It has this kind of center part here, and then these two little bulbous parts on the sides. And that's called the trochlea. All right. Now we're gonna move down to, should I get everything? Yes, I did. All right, we're gonna move down here and we're gonna look at the ulna and the radius. Okay, now first, to make this make sense, let me show this to you all together. Okay, so here you can see an articulated ulna and radius, and these are pieced together with a hand here. And you can see that if I have my humerus here, we put the little notch in the front, with a little fossa, and look at this, okay? Actually, my bad. Okay, here you go. All right, so I want you to notice something here, okay? I want you to notice that this part right here of the ulna is going to articulate or come up against this part, which we said is our trochlea. Well, that's good because this has a name, and this is called the trochlear notch. Okay. And if I look at it here, this part, right, this part here, this whole kind of notch is called the trochlear notch. We also said that if I have this guy, again, right, and he's gonna bend like this, we said that this point here was our coronoid fossa. Well, guess what? This part that goes right into our coronoid fossa is called our coronoid process. So this is our coronoid process. So trochlea, trochlear notch, coronoid fossa, coronoid process. Okay, and guess what? Olecranon fossa, okay, olecranon fossa, olecranon process. So they're literally named after where they are going to articulate or meet up, okay? We know that this is the ulna because it has this U shape up at the top, U for ulna. An interesting thing about the ulna is that the head of the ulna is not up here. It's actually down here, okay? So don't get that one messed up. That's a common mistake. We also have something called an ulnar styloid process, and it's this little piece that's gonna stick off. Now remember what we said about a process, right? We said that a process is a sticky offy piece, right? It's a little piece of bone that sticks off a bigger bone. Well, here we said we tend to have something called a styloid process when it's kind of pointy like a stylus. So just like we saw with our styloid process in the skull, here we see the styloid process of the ulna, or the ulnar styloid process, and it's gonna be pointy. We also see that on the radius, we will also see a styloid process, or a pointy part, a pointy sticky offy piece. And here you see the pointy part, the radial styloid process. This is the head, and that's gonna make sense. This head is round, okay, and round like the radius of a circle. So we can remember that the radius has a round head. Here we can see how they articulate again. We see that there's this little notch here on the ulna, and that is where that head of the radius is gonna come and meet it, just like we see here, okay? So again, the head of the ulna, remember, is down here. We have our ulnar styloid process. Here's our radial styloid process. The head of the radius is up here, okay? Moving on, we'll go to look at our hand. All right, and we have some bones that we need to learn in the hand as well. We'll see first that we have metacarpals. That's these bones here. These are numbered. The first metacarpal is where the thumb is. It's attached to the thumb. Second metacarpal, third metacarpal, fourth metacarpal, and our fifth metacarpal is going to be attached to the pinky. We also have our phalanges. That's plural for phalanx. We'll see that we have a proximal, middle, or intermediate, and distal phalanx. So if it were plural, we'd say these are proximal phalanges, these are medial phalanges, and these are distal phalanges. Now notice I haven't pointed to the thumb yet, and that's because it's a little bit different. Now what you don't want to get confused with here is that, remember, this is the first metacarpal. That is not a phalanx, that is not a phalange, okay? This is your proximal phalanx, and this is your distal phalanx. There is no middle phalanx for the thumb. Next, we do want to learn the bones of the hand. And I know, it's intimidating, but don't worry, we have tricks, okay? We always come with tricks. We start over here where the thumb is, and we start at the bottom. And of course, as we do, we have a mnemonic. The mnemonic is some like the pinky, here comes the thumb. All right, so that will be scaphoid, so some, scaphoid, like, lunate, triquetrum. Notice this piece here, the triquetrum, has a piece sticking off of it, which is actually another bone, and that's the pisiform. And it's kind of coming off of it. It seems like it's projecting off, but actually it's a bone. Okay, so scaphoid. Scaphoid has a kind of L shape. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform. And then we said, here comes the thumb. Hamate, capitate, I'm going backwards, but trapezium and trapezoid. Okay. All right, so hopefully that helps. Just go ahead and practice that. Write out that mnemonic and go through it a few times. Remember, you will start at the thumb, go toward the pinky, and then go back toward the thumb, right? Some like the pinky, here comes the thumb. All right, that's it. Stay tuned for part 4 where we will talk about the leg.